Bill.
Pam, thanks very much. As the only non-librarian in the room, I think, I need to start off with a disclaimer. Although I've worked with 14 or 15 different library systems in the state, I'm kind of intimidated by you guys. Because when you're in my business, you can throw a lot of crap out there and people will accept it. Most of my clients in the corporate world, you can say almost anything, and if you're out of town, people say, yeah, yes, right now. But you guys and gals insist on knowing what the source is. I just can't get away with my normal pattern. It's got to be factual. Because librarians are, by definition, some of the most literate, best read, most knowledgeable people I know. So with that in mind, I'm sure everybody in the room, with a possible exception of Jamie, is well familiar with this book. No matter how small a city or town you come from, you're in there. It's great information. As library professionals, probably many of you are familiar with this book, just out in the last year or so. And certainly as literate, well-read North Carolinians, everybody is familiar with this classic piece of American literature, in which noted author John A.G. explores the wonderful world of oxymorons. Those phrases, the first part of which directly contradict the second. And after having reviewed all of those in use today, Mr. A.G. has compiled a list of the top 10. And they are as follows. So here you are on an otherwise perfectly good Monday afternoon, having to confront two of those without benefit of the third. So if I see a suspiciously high number of cell phone calls requiring people to leave the room, I understand. I mean, you just heard from a great practitioner whose skills are not just library science this morning. So what's this guy doing here? So I'm going to prove my props to you. The people who asked today, what's the name of the laughing possum book? That's it. Frustrated librarian, apparently. But in any case, I'm going to echo much of what Jamie said today. A couple of different slants on a couple of different occasions because, as Pam said, most of my work's in the corporate arena. I'll bring a slightly different perspective to it. I know some of the questions that get asked of me, many of them have to do with one word that we're going to talk about several times today. And I'm not going to do all the talking. We'll shut up, and as Jamie did, ask questions throughout. And we'll leave some time at the end for conclusions to be drawn. But most of us grew in a time when the world seemed to be a fairly stable place. Today, it looks more like this. And one of the biggest challenges any organization has, and the library profession in particular has, is this. You're fighting for relevance. You got a number of people who don't think you're relevant anymore, not as relevant. And some of those people are in key funding places. I've worked with, I think, 15 different library systems, almost without exception. Their funding comes from a city council or a county commission, the majority of whose members have not darkened a library door. They think of the library as something, I remember that, I went to one when I was in high school, back in '63, back in '72. It was nice for its time, and I kind of like it, but not really relevant to my life today, not to my family. So from the standpoint of when you take a look at libraries, we grew up in a time when there was that halo effect, warm and fuzzy, they were nice, everybody liked them. But particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, as the economy has gotten tight, warm and fuzzies don't mean that much anymore. The halo is darkened. And in some cases, the halo is disintegrated altogether. You work in many different environments. There's the financial environment, the political environment, socio-demographic environment, all sorts of things. Technological environment. Things change quicker than they ever did. I bought a new camera 2 weeks ago. It was state of the art. It's now a generation old. No matter how much money you spend on trying to keep your technology library up, it's never stay different. In the time when we grew up, life cycle looked something like this. There was a gradual upward movement. In And the idea was before you hit the decline, you reinvented yourself. That was true whether it were libraries, corporations, my kind of company, whoever. The idea was to move ahead of the curve, re-energize yourself. Those are the old days. Kids today, us today, the life cycle curve has compacted. Things happen a lot more quickly. You need to catch that slope much more quickly. And there are a lot of organizations out there who are not wired for that voltage, can't handle that speed. And those companies and those institutions, it's the difference from driving on 85 or 40 coming over here today, putting in on the fast tracks of NASCAR. And Jamie, you'll have to forgive us. You don't come into North Carolina without hearing at least one NASCAR reference. I'm going to wait out late early, and then we can move on to one person. But for those who can't handle the speed, those organizations look something like this. And there are plenty of institutions that we grew up with, they couldn't handle the speed either. Here are some of them. Six organizations. At one point, they were all the dominant or a dominant player in their field. They had that in common. And now they have something else in common. And I say without fear of successful contradiction that there are people out there, some people in positions of influence, who think that's your future. Just not really relevant. Nice, but in today's economic times, we've got priorities elsewhere. We've got other purveyors of information I can count on. Anybody familiar with Bone Bits? Many people are. One of the key stories in there is what happened to the written version of Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, when I went to high school in Aiken, South Carolina, Encyclopedia Britannica was the gold standard of information. If you had a high school paper to do, you rushed down to Aiken County Library to make sure you got the Encyclopedia Britannica and not Collier's or World Book or one of those other third or fourth class. You know what I'm talking about. It was. In 1909, not that long ago, that was their annual sales figure. $650 million a year. What happened over the next 10 years was sales declined by 82%, which graphically looks something like this. What happened? Well, obviously the internet, other forms of media. Challenge is this. To some people, and I work with them, your relevance looks something like that. It's not the actuality, but it is the perception. The challenge then is not one of service. Librarians are some of the most innovative people. I didn't even hear some of the stuff that Jamie talked about today. Most innovative people I know. But advocacy, as far as I know, is not given much priority in terms of schools of library science. How many of you who are library directors like Donna or key staff members had advocacy written as part of your job description? I bet not many. Going forward, if you're a library director, advocacy cannot be thought of as an afterthought. It's not something you do when other real stuff gets out of the way. It's got to be a core value. And I love the term that Jamie used earlier this morning in terms of merchandising, as I understood it correctly. You need to think of yourself in that light. Because that is what you're fighting for. And it is on that issue that you'll rise or fall. Everybody read that? I'll go back. She's right. And most of you do that already. And yet too many members of city and county commissions and too many members of the state legislature in Raleigh and some people in your community and the business community don't think of you that way at all. So the advocacy, in a certain extent, is marketing against perception, defining unique value. I mean, these two great books talk about things that I was unfamiliar with before. They're full of innovation, full of creativity, but it's not the way many people think of it. Just the other day, I don't know if anybody else in the state has this. This is on the Catawba County Library website. Just hold your smartphone up to it, click on it, and you have access to the full library in-house. Anybody else have that? Is that just new to me, or is that relatively new to the profession? He asked non-rhetorically, is that new to me, or?
Did you just mean the use of QR codes?
Yeah, he's done that. So, here is a main problem. Too often, the answer to that question is us, or you. And I'll go specifically to the legislative day held back in February and held annually. Would anybody hire my company by asking me, Bill, is yours a good company? I am the worst spokesman in the room for the quality of my company. Conversely, to a neutral or negative audience, you are the worst people in the state to speak about the importance of what you do. Love the fact that Jamie today repeatedly talked about different messengers, not the librarian. And I would contend that it's great to have a friends group. It's great to have a library board. But there's a certain advantage when you come to advocacy, to maintaining a group who are really advocates, but they're not locked in, as they don't have that friends of the library on them. Because when you go down to the General Assembly, the Battlefield General Assembly, I'll tell you a story. I was down there 2 weeks after you were here, down there in February. Met with a couple of legislators. I don't always respect them, but I understand they are in positions of influence. You need to at least respect their position. I was asking this one guy from Mecklenburg, Charlotte, what's the last couple of weeks been like? I'm going to paraphrase this only slightly. He said, well, last week I had a bunch of librarians come in here and talk about how important libraries were. I just got through with a meeting this morning with early educators telling me about the importance of early education. Didn't believe any of it. I know it. They're getting paid to say that. You need to get the advocates to be people who are not only not directly connected to you, but even one step away from you. So it doesn't look as though, I'm John Franklin, I'm here from IBM, I'm a friend of the library, let me tell you how important they are. Much better if they say, I'm John Franklin, I'm from IBM, let me tell you about libraries and what they've meant to me. Break that connection with some of the key advocates. They lose credibility when they become part of you. We look at the advocacy program, and it's a really good website. You need to think of this. Libraries, they're a product. They fight for dollar share and mind share just like anything else. Jamie's language again, merchandising. Not that many librarians are comfortable with that. It also almost seems to denigrate the importance, the quality of what you do, and I recognize that importance and I recognize that quality. But when you take a look at advocacy, you're really talking about, in real world terms, marketing. You can dress it up, you can call it advocacy, it sounds more noble. It's marketing. Your success will depend on how well you market. And when you talk about marketing issues, there are these sorts of issues, most of which Jamie hit on. And when you market any product, at all, whether it is a widescreen television, Philly baseball tickets, even something as lowly as an orange juice, remember this, or library, excuse me. The days of mass markets are diminishing. Most of us grew up in a time of mass markets. Increasingly, the organizations, be they public, nonprofit, corporate, whatever, that successfully market, that successfully advocate for their product, recognize that increasingly we're talking about markets of one. Jamie's different than I am on certain things. I agree with him on certain things. His interests are different. Same thing with Jennifer. Everybody in this room, nobody is exactly the same. My best opportunity to sell you my services is if I find out about you, what makes you tick, and position the company in that respect. She's a market. He's a market. He's a market. They're all markets. I've got 4 individual family members up there. You don't appeal to them the same way on anything, you're going to lose 3 of them. If I'm trying to sell them the worth of getting Dad a new iPhone for Christmas, I use different arguments on my son than I do my wife. When you come to developing an advocacy or marketing strategy going forward, the measure is not whether you get the word out there. That's a means. The end is this. You want more people in it. And you want to be able to translate that to more financial support, whether that is to a city council, county commission, a state legislature, a foundation, whatever. Too many marketing programs, and I've seen a bunch of them in the corporate world. Some PR firm comes in and says, we had great success. We got 784 messages in the last year. We got you placed in these different things. So what? What happened to the bottom line? And if nothing happened to the bottom line, then what you got was a marketing program or a marketing firm got a nice commission and nothing happens for you. So ultimately, again, Jamie was on target with this. The advocacy program, you measure it in terms of what happened. So what? In terms of the mass markets and the segmented markets, mass market looks something like this. You've got one big target you're getting out there. And when Jamie talked about framing the message, he's absolutely right. You're framing that for a broad audience, and that's part of marketing. But this is the other part. There is one message that goes out, or a set of messages, those 4 issues that Jamie talked about. That's for widespread distribution. That won't take you all the way, though. You've got different targets here, and we'll talk about it a little later. There's a city commissioner. There's a county legislator. There's a state legislator. There's a businessman. There's a foundation. You don't tell them about you. You tell them about you only in the context of what's important to them. Segmented marketing. Now, mass markets have a message, and it's the frame. It's very, very important. Let me ask you a question. Think of it as the mission. I hate the term mission statements, but the mission and the frame is about the same thing. So here's today's first question. Anybody got an answer?
We make your day.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Make my day.
Make your day. I like that one too. Here's the film I'm talking about.
Good,
Bad, ugly. Library frames come in all flavors. I'll give you some examples. Here's one. As best as I can determine it, that library's frame is to be a library. Accurate, but not much of a stretch. That's ugly. That is horribly ugly, obviously written by a consultant because real people don't talk that way. Be a learning nexus, okay. Wait, what? Okay, I kind of get the target audience, but what the hell are you selling? Let's look at some better ones.
That sounds like millet spin.
Kind of like this one, because it makes a distinction between knowledge and information, and that's your business. That's one of the things that separates you from Google and everything else. You're in the truth business. And I like the bottom one. It talks about our collective quality of life. It talks about library roles in individuals and also all of us together. Kind of lengthy, not particularly appropriately formatted, doesn't punch at you, but the concepts are good. again, personal and professional lives, spirit of community, diversity. And the last line is one that if it's not part of your frame, you are missing out. Because in today's environment, you better be selling yourself as an economic driver. And not in a general way as currently shows up on the North Carolina Public Library Directors Association website. It's got a fact sheet, but it's accurate, but it's too general. Love what Jamie talked about. You've got to factor it down to specific stories and individuals that people can relate to. And we'll give you a good example of that here shortly. Now we're getting there. Very close to the 4 points that Jamie talked about earlier. So if you're going to start off advocacy program, what are you advocating? You're going to advocate a learning nexus. Well, that's what we're in the business in. That's a saleable product. It speaks to a number of different people. It's a broad message and it works. But again, the broad message by itself is not enough when you're dealing with a neutral or a hostile crowd. Too often the library stories, well, one of the problems in advocacy, and how ironic can this be? Libraries don't have enough stories. Could there be anything more ironic than that? So I heard Carol and some others talk about during the break about we need to beef up the stories well before the next legislative day to do. And I love the fact that in North Carolina, one of our flaws is we're too nice. Somebody throws a story out there and we say, "That's kind of a good story." Somebody threw a story out this morning. Jamie said, "That's boring." I hate that damn story. You better come up with a better one. I spent some time out in Colorado, so I understand this position. We need more of it.
I like it.
That's right. You were the one he said it to, weren't you?
I thought that's good.
That is good. That absolutely is good. So start off, and you don't have to do this through a strategic initiative. Start off and look about it. To start, what are you saying about yourself? What are you saying right now? Does it look like the VHAG thing? Does it look something like this? Or does it seem to be a traditional, we supply information to folks? But the start, the frame's got to be correct. Here's something you always hear the PR firms say: stay on message. Stay on message. You hear it in political campaigns, you hear it in the corporate world, there it goes. It's a lousy message. Because if you got the wrong message out there, consistency is no virtue. You want to get the right message. Wrong message, consistency is counterproductive. Now, go back to the segmented markets. When I first got married, and my wife sent me down to, I guess it was Piggly Wiggly at the time, to buy Minute Maid frozen orange juice. That's a pretty simple task. There it was. When I am ordered now to go down for Minute Maid frozen orange juice, I go over to the frozen food compartment. I can find that, but I can also find this. Each of them appealing to a different segment, a different sub-market. Minute Maid realizes we just can't throw Minute Maid out there. You just can't throw libraries out there. And incidentally, that's just the orange juices. You want to go to all their juices, more than 100. Each of them aimed differently. This idea of segmented marketing, it's more than 30 years ago now that Burger King was one of the first companies to latch on to this. What would they say? Absolutely, have it your way. They were going up against, they wanted market penetration against McDonald's and a couple of others that were established at the time. If you're old enough like me, remember this. You went to McDonald's, if you didn't want it with ketchup and onions and lettuce or whatever, you had to wait about 6 or 7 minutes for them to special prep one. Well, Burger King says to hell with that. Have it your way. And what did that mean? Who remembers the jingle? Greg, you were singing it back there, weren't you? Can you sing it for us now?
You hold the pickle.
There you go. There you go. Now, that philosophy was adopted by a lot of very successful companies. They recognized that, different permutations, was actually calculated 221,000, whatever the number is, 84 different ways to have the Whopper. It was about the customer, not the restaurant. Other companies started addressing this. Dell, they made their marketplace by have it your way. Except have it your way for Dell was not hold the pickles, hold the onions, whatever the rest of it is. It was clock speed, hard drive, different ways of inputting data. Have it your way. When I grew up in Aiken, South Carolina, we had 2 television networks. Turned on the set, wait for it to warm up. And about 8 minutes later, CBS, right? Or if we didn't like what was on CBS, 2 clicks, ABC. Or if it was raining between Aiken and Columbia, South Carolina, and Dad tweaked the rabbit ears just right, it was NBC night at the Millets. Big times. A whole new world opened up. 3 channels. Here's the first page of the alternatives today. My first page. There is a Food Network. There's a Golf Channel. Is it out of the realm of possibility to think that 5 years from now there'll be a Broccoli Channel? A 7-hour network? No. We are sliced and diced in a number of ways. And if you are any institution going out there with one general message, you're going to be falling behind. Not only do I have all those channels, but with TiVo or something like it, I can watch television my way. The hell with when CBS wants me to watch it, I'll watch it when I want to see it. I'll have it my way, which echoes what? Burger King. So I'm suggesting that an advocacy philosophy that should drive libraries looks something like this. I don't mean that in a literal sense, but I mean, think of it that way. You've got different segments you're shooting for. How do we position the library for each of those markets when we can do that to be most appealing to them? Because then the pitch becomes about them, not about the library. Now you can't do that for 60,000 different citizens. But we'll talk about this a little bit later. The idea is somewhere in each city or county in this room, there are 10, 15, 20, maybe the number's 45, people of influence who are now either neutral or negative towards libraries. That list ought to be populated by people, not friends, but those who think you're irrelevant or something else. Identify who they are. Identify who can get to them. Identify what their hot buttons are. How do you package the library, the totality of what you do, to appeal to them and bring them on board? Or let them attend Legislative Advocacy Day. Let them walk the halls in Raleigh or the council chambers. You know, knowledge for a lifetime, lifetime learning. That's a typical message. But I want to contend you sell yourself short when you just say knowledge for a lifetime. Because it's true. From early literacy to all levels of education, go out in the business world, either as a small businessman or woman, through retirement, the library has something to offer you. But you have something to offer beyond that. Think of the woman, pregnant woman, who goes to the library to learn about how to treat her fetus. Think about at some point everybody in this room will be dead. But there'll be people interested in the genealogy of it. So you are literally knowledge for a lifetime and before and beyond. Can you name another institution in your community, in the state, who covers that multiplicity of clients? Church, huh? Depending on your religious belief, yes. I'm not sure. For those who believe in the afterlife, yes, ma'am. Okay, well, being in position with the church ain't bad company to keep. You can develop messages, stories. Stories is a much better term. You can develop stories on all of that. But the stories need to be compelling and they need to be personalized. And as you approach, if you like the idea of developing that hit list of people in our community that we need to bring on board as advocates, You don't sell them just the general message. You don't sell them all of that. What pieces are most relevant to them? We'll talk about that shortly as well. But whether you're talking about the public as a whole, the business community, members of the North Carolina General Assembly, when it comes to libraries, they fall into these general categories. Those who are always with you, always will be, you can count on them, you know they're there. Then you got a bunch you don't think you're relevant. It'd be tough to switch those folks. And between those two extremes, there's various degrees of support or lack thereof. They look something like this. You don't turn them around overnight. You don't turn them around with the same message, with the same advocacy approach. You find out what that person or that cluster of people is interested in, what makes a difference to him or her. You get the right message, the right messengers, again, a point made this morning, the right timing, you present the case, and then you start making these sorts of changes. Little improvements here. In each case, you're turning a neutral or negative into a somewhat more positive position. And that's the way funding bottles along. Message, messengers, timing, specificity. A matter of specificity. Anybody remember this mechanism? Or some of you use it, some of you do not. Take a minute and read that. If you're trying to make the economic case for libraries, you're going to use something that the ALA said or something from Bloomberg Business Week. ALA, by definition, has limited credibility for those who aren't on board already. ALA says libraries are important. Wow, who'd have thought? Bloomberg Business Week said it. Interestingly, here, they're actually citing an ALA report. But they have conveyed upon it credibility by reporting it in their piece. And if you go again, and this is not a knock at NCPLDA, because I have a healthy respect for that group and its leadership. But if you go to the website now, there's a lot about the library's important role in terms of economic recovery and that sort of thing. Everybody's seen it. But it's very general. You can't make a case between strong libraries and a strong economy unless the link is steel. And right now, too often, it looks something like this. It requires somewhat of a leap of faith. Yeah, libraries do good stuff. I'm sure there's somebody in there getting a job. Probably somebody, maybe somebody starting a business. That's what you say on your website right now. And it talks about the number of librarians helping people find employment. And the story about whether it's Walmart or McDonald's. And that's all good. That's not going to resonate with those hard asses in Raleigh, who's a prime target, or those men and women on city and county councils who are fighting tough budget battles. It's not that they're anti-library, it's just not particularly relevant with all those immediate pressing things. It's got to be harder than we're helping people find jobs. So I'm going to ask you to define, as Jamie did earlier, your economic impact story by giving you a good one. Anybody recognize the building? It's Patrick Beaver, the main branch of the Hickory Public Library. Meet Greg Scoob. In his hand is his business plan for starting a firm. Using the resources of the Hickory Public Library, he started Lance Transport Company, which 5 years after he started it, had almost a $4 million payroll and was paying close to, was it $500,000? Yeah, $500,000 in payroll taxes. There's a message that will resonate with funding sources if you can draw a hard and fast connection to the library. which Mr. Skoog, to his credit, did. Now, who do you want walking the halls on legislative day? You or Greg Skoog and his counterparts across the state? Who makes a bigger difference in county courthouses? Here's a drop ball. We talked about this at a strategic planning meeting of the State Library Directors Association about 4 years ago. We gave a couple of other examples and made a recommendation that each library, 78, 79, what's the number now? Pam? 77. If even 3/4 of you could develop a story, and that doesn't have to be this big in scope, maybe it is a couple of people who do help-time jobs, and you came up with a storybook tying particular success examples to particular people, to particular libraries, that would be an asset going forward. Suppose you had done that 3 years ago, and this legislative day, you went down there with a book, Libraries Impact North Carolina's Economy. And you had some great stories like this, and maybe some that weren't quite like that, but still, you would be far better positioned to compete for mind share and dollar share than you are right now. Train's left the station, but the caboose is not pulled out yet. And I would challenge you that a prime responsibility, going back to something Carol said during the break, find the specific stories that are tied to economic matters. Economy matters now more than it has in the time that most of us have been adults. If you can successfully tie the importance of what you do to an economic payoff, you're ahead of the game. If you'd done it 4 years ago, you'd be much better positioned. And I know that sounds kind of like Monday morning quarterbacking, but it's not, because I suggested it 4 years ago. A lot of my suggestions are full of crap. That was a good one. All right, that's correct. If you think I'm right. Now the other, it's not just the entrepreneurial growth. Here's some other key roles for economic librarians, economic positions. There is that one. There are other stories. Job finding, we talked about a little bit. Career advancement. That one I didn't hear get mentioned. But it's the person who's using the library to self-improve for a better position within his or her own company, or a different company. Personal investing. There are a lot, particularly of the 50s and olders, who don't have access to other resources, who are down there, whether it's Wall Street Journal, Barron's, whatever. They're making determinations as to how much money they'll have for retirement and for the kids' education. Find those stories. You're in the knowledge business. You're in the business of cutting through all sorts of information and translating it into knowledge. Who better positioned to develop these stories than you guys? And then there's this one, quality of life, and I want to tell a story here. I used to direct economic development for the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce. The largest corporate relocation that happened during my time there was 1,200 jobs coming out of Manhattan, Royal Insurance Company. They were looking at Charlotte, Atlanta, Tampa, Nashville, and Dallas-Fort Worth. When they made their announcement that they were bringing those jobs to Charlotte, the chairman of the board, George Ansbro, stood up and said, and he was not blowing smoke, 2 things separated Charlotte from the other 4 deserving communities. Wasn't the cost of labor, wasn't the availability of power. The 2 things he identified were the best early education support system in terms of child care that they found in any of the areas. That was important because they had a lot of employees who were young parents. And the other thing was that was the year that the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Library was the National Public Library of the Year. He said knowledge infrastructure is important to us. He recognized that when people think knowledge, too often it's K through 12, or it's K through post-secondary. To the companies you want the most, knowledge infrastructure is pre-K through retirement and everything in between, including a library that can support that. Now, I travel around a lot with corporations, and I've been in some of your communities and some of your libraries. In the early stages of a site search for where to put a new or expanded facility, companies travel incognito. They don't want the name out there. You can't go into a school system without signing in, for perfectly understandable reasons, without signing in and saying who you're with and showing some sort of ID. But you can go in a library. And library stops are one of the things we always do. We always go in the library because we don't want to identify ourselves. And what typically will happen, the men and women on the team of the early decision-making team will go in. They'll start looking around. They'll say, okay, my favorite author is whomever. Maybe a Sherlock Holmes fan. How much of how many volumes of Doyle do you have? Do you have the complete collection? They'll go and take a look at the music catalog. Or if they're a kid, and this happens all the time. If they're a young kid, they're a reader, they'll go see, how many copies of Harry Potter, whatever, is in there. If you're not closely tied to the chamber's fallen down on its job because the chamber does not recognize that you are part of the quality of life that's used in the decision-making process. Reach out to them if they're not reaching out to you. And if you want to tell them there's this clown down in Charlotte who tells you that you're missing the boat if you're not using the library as part of the sale, I'll be glad to make that call. So, who's got a really good library economic impact study? Yes, ma'am. Can I be Jamie, or do I have to be Megan when I hear your story? Great story. That may just be, that's just one person, but you put that in a volume that includes bigger stories. Each story benefits from the other stories. So that's a chapter. We've got the guy in Hickory, he's a chapter. What other chapters have we got? What other pages have we got?
There's a person in our community that was out of work and she started using the library's resources to learn about catering business, and she's since opened her own catering business, and she's one of the prime people that our chamber uses for catering.
Perfect.
She always talks about how she found those resources at the library.
Oh, right. Right. Did you take her down to Legislative Day, Donna? You weren't directly then, though, were you? Okay, next year. What else? The silence is somewhat deafening. Okay? It's not an insult, don't mean it that way. But again, some of you may think, and I understand why, the confidentiality of what people do in the library is an important part of what makes a library special. You can't go in and say, Michael, what you looking at there? Are you starting a business, or what exactly are you doing? Michael's got all sorts of proprietary stuff, but I understand why you can't do that. But I will say there are libraries who is something as simple as putting something on their website or posting a sign on the front door. If you've used the library for an economic success story, we'd love to hear it. You can generate these things. There are more than 4 or 5 of them out there. And people are normally willing to become your advocates. I mean, one of the reasons that Greg Scoot became an advocate, aside from the fact he truly appreciated what the Hickory Public Library did for him, that gave him a chance to advertise Lance Transport. So it's motivated by self-interest and greater community interest. That's a winning proposition. Find those stories. Put that economic impact book together. As Jamie said, you make it specific. You don't talk about we're helping people find jobs. Your story, great stories. Package them with other stories. Let a legislator know, here's the difference we're making. This is unassailable. Say, for the companies you really want, and those are the companies I work with, not every company you really want works with me, but the core principle of my company is to only work with people we respect and organizations we like. And that excludes a lot of people. I know that sounds cocky, but it does. One of the reasons we spend so much time in libraries, we believe in the importance of what you're doing. Anybody here old enough to remember the landmark and the signature stories of books? Please, somebody else be old like me. Huh? Do you remember? Jamie does. We're going to our 40th high school reunion. We're good. But that was, Sort of thing, we always appreciate your parents. Unlike, I had a great dad, great mom. I remember going down the library every Saturday, picking out either a landmark or a signature series of books. They were about people, or in the case of landmark, signature was about people, and landmark was about events, as I recall, like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they instilled in me a love of reading right from the start. That stayed with me. I made sure my kids had exactly the same sort of thing. So, from the standpoint of the companies you really want, they're looking at what does Durham, what does Mecklenburg, what does Wayne County, what does the San Hills region offer us? Because if we're going to make an investment, if we're going to put $500 million into Mecklenburg County or somewhere else in 2012, we expect to be here for 15 or 20 years. We want to know what's going on, not just in terms of capable workforce today, but how do I know I'm going to be globally competitive 15, 20 years from now? What's going on? And part of the answer to that is what the library is doing or not doing to support that. So intellectual capital, for the companies you really want, he said repetitively, that is your leading asset or liability. It's not cheap land, cheap. You're going to lure somebody with cheap land, fine. You'll hold them until somebody else is cheaper. For a long time, North and South Carolina won the economic development game by being cheaper than anybody else. We were cheaper than Colorado. We were cheaper than Michigan. People came here, cheap land, cheap labor, cheap. Well, economic development doesn't take place on a national level anymore. It's not state versus state, it's nation versus nation. The United States, nowhere in the United States will ever be the cheapest place to do business again. The Carolinas will thrive or fall backwards going forward in terms of our ability to produce smart people, not cheap land. Everything's global. The churn that's marked the last 4 or 5 years, that's permanent. That's not coming back. Well, that's not going away, excuse me. The jobs we've lost, they're not coming back. The churn will always be there. Jamie alluded to this. A large part of your future is determined by your ability to support those. You've got to position the library as a critical part of the knowledge infrastructure. How many people, and the answer to this may be a lot, which would be good. As you think now in terms of your primary funding source, City Council, County Commission, how many libraries represented here think that the majority members of your primary funding source think of you as part of the knowledge infrastructure? Good. How have you made that happen? Either one of you.
Cumberland County. Our director makes a very concerted effort to communicate with the county commissioners any chance she gets, and we've developed specific marketing materials to take to them, telling individual stories that we've collected throughout the year.
Right.
We probably have 400 based on a small campaign we did.
And we've reached out to people like the Arts Council or the City Council or Base Realignment, anybody that will talk about how good we're to have around.
Base Realignment, great story for North Carolina with a heavy military presence. Really good stories. I suspect you're going to have some people buttonhole you at the first break. That's good stuff. When you have the right knowledge infrastructure in place, it drives through every other part of your community. And then the magic happens. You reach a critical mass of economic activity. And you get all sorts of interplay, all sorts of benefit. But the knowledge infrastructure is not there, the benefit goes away. The community looks like this. And we know of places in North Carolina that were booming in 1990 that are sucking wind now. Industry segments. Places that counted on the cheapness continuing to be an asset going forward. And the textile plants closed. And furniture went away. The land was still there, the buildings were still there, but they're pretty much empty now because the people needed to fill positions aren't there locally. You've probably seen that every day there's an article in Wall Street Journal or somewhere else about a company that is moving overseas, not because it's cheaper over there, but because they can't find skilled labor here. AT&T, Dallas-Fort Worth, 2 months ago, said we got 5,000 jobs here. You haven't got skills here to fill them, so we're going elsewhere. Not, we do have a shortage of quality jobs, so we have a greater shortage of quality people to fill the quality jobs that are here now. That's got to be a critical, that's got to be part of And it is just a somewhat of a rephrasing of one of the ones that Jamie threw out there. Item 4, I think it was. Here's something else that particularly talked about, let's tailor the message to a particular member of city council or county commission. Suppose you've got somebody there who just became a mom or dad, or a grandmother or a grandfather for the first time. Here's the message to take to him. Those young children today, their world will be totally different than anything any of us grew up in. Totally. Their competition will be more intense, more complex. Think of it this way. When I grew up in Aiken, my competition for quality jobs, I was thinking about the kids in the Carolinas along the Atlantic seaboard. Anybody here a new mom or new granddad, or vice versa, or whatever? Anybody here have a kid under 8 years old? Okay, thank you. Mike is son or daughter?
Son, James.
James.
7.
James at 7. James Lambert at 7. James's competition for quality future is growing up on at least 4, probably 5 other continents. James needs to be prepared in a way that Michael never had to be. Competition is everywhere. You need to utilize every knowledge piece that's out there. Put in context, we'll see where James's competition is. Look here and here, and let's not talk about the generalities. A lot of people over there. Let's look at it this way. If you take the smartest 28% of kids in India, or the smartest 25% of kids in China, that's more smart kids than America's got kids. Think of that for a minute. So if you drive around North Carolina and you see a bumper sticker that looks something like this, feel good for that family, but know that those other countries have more honor students than we have students. We cannot afford to let any part of the knowledge infrastructure degrade. You know, back in the old, when I was growing up, it was us versus the Ruskies. Fairly simple strategy. We outperformed them. Now everybody's got pieces in play. The game's a lot more complex. And our kids and our companies, that's what they'll be doing. That's what they're doing now. Can they handle that voltage? Talked about the connection with the chamber. Here's somebody who thinks that what you do is important. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, its Institute on Workforce Development, came out with a report a year and a half ago. So there are 4 pillars of workforce development. You touch every one of those. You need to make that message in specific terms. What are examples of what you've done through all stages? And the reason that's so important goes back to what I was saying about China and India, and places like Brazil, and Russia, and other emerging markets. We comprise less than 6% of the world's population. Of that 6%, at least 30% do not graduate from high school. A third of that group that graduates from high school and goes on to college has to be in remedial education, which suggests what the hell they graduate from high school for in the first place. Our educational, our knowledge level versus the rest of the world is measurably disintegrating. And our position has sort of been, stand back a little, we're America, we're coming through, we're God's chosen people, don't worry about us. And that attitude is rapidly sinking us into mediocrity. And I could show you the numbers, but I won't. I won't show you all of them. Here's a good example, not of the numbers, but of the situation we're facing. Robin Lee founded Baidu, which is the Chinese Google. Y'all remember the stuff in the paper about a year and a half ago about Google being bounced out of China and whether it was going to go to Taiwan or no big deal for the Chinese. They only had about 30% market penetration there. Baidu is their primary search engine. Robin Lee, the founder, was on the campus of Stanford about 6 months ago. Stanford, where Google was founded, and said this. And from a strictly numerical basis, he is right. We are outnumbered. We cannot afford to be outnumbered and outsmarted. We cannot afford to let our knowledge pieces fade. I have found that to be a message that will resonate with a hard-nosed member of the General Assembly who could care less about putting an individual to work, or all those really neat stories. I don't mean to diminish the importance of the individual stories. For certain audiences, that doesn't mean a thing. But you start framing it patriotically, in the decline of America. That'll get somebody's attention. Not everybody's. Pick your message, pick your messenger. About a year ago now, Newsweek had a cover story on creativity. There are ways of measuring that. And for the first time in recorded history, American creativity is declining. Creativity can be engendered in the earliest years, and that goes back to some of the message. That's what particularly that early learning. It's not just literacy, it's imagination, it's creativity, inspiration. That's your product. But the article said this: unlike so many other countries, we have no national policy. Hell, we have no national policy on much of anything these days. But we don't have anything on creativity. And Judy Estrin, a really great gal, on Closing the Innovation Gap, says this: our education system right now, one that was started by President Bush and has basically been embraced with some changes by President Obama, no child left behind. Judy says not only does that not foster creativity, but it limits it. What you call it, teaching the test, whatever. Children are measured, and teachers are measured by the ability of kids to memorize something and vomit it back out 3 or 4 weeks later. That's not what knowledge is about today. She concludes this way: that's what we're doing. We're producing robots. Other nations are teaching at the earliest years, giving kids possible ideas and saying, you pick the best one. Or they're throwing out challenges. Okay, what's the best way to navigate that maze? And getting to think like this. Or saying, okay, here's a mousetrap. What's the best way to extricate that cheese? Do I come out of the hole, sneak around back, and pull it off this way? Do I take my best friend and throw him on the cheese? Or is there a better way altogether? That sort of innovation, creativity, that's what you do. And that, by and large, is not what the traditional K-12 education system in the country is doing now. Anybody familiar with this term? Okay. Learn it, he said presumptuously, and use it often. The fraction of obsolete and knowledge. And the point is this: things are happening so quickly now that what was true yesterday ain't true no more. Well, the knowledge base has been expanded, so it's obsolete knowledge. We have an education system predicated on memorizing stuff. Other countries, those ones that are outperforming us, and they are countless, teaching people how to think, cope, collaborate, differentiate. You know what that is, don't you? When it comes to education knowledge, that's what it used to be. We used to be number one, and not that long ago. Hell, it used to be if you went off to Duke or NC State and you had a Commodore 64, you were state of the art. 64K of memory, what in the hell can you do with all that? Used to be you could drop out of high school in North Carolina and find a pretty decent job in a textile mill. Used to be that was the state library. Anybody been up there, third floor of the state capitol? That was it. Used to be. We used to be number one in matters of education and knowledge. Now let me show you some new numbers. How about, hang on the sound of USA, we're number 14. We're number 17. We're number 25. That wouldn't bother me a bit if those were soccer rankings, but they're not. Every 3 years, there's an international organization that judges the comparative skills of 15-year-olds in 40 countries on reading, science, math, other sorts of things. In 2009, the last time it was measured, of 40 countries, we were 14th in terms of reading, 17th in terms of science, and 25th in terms of math, putting us in this distinguished company. Some of them nice places to visit, but that's not the intellectual capital or company I want to keep. The same organization that came out with the study said, you want to turn that around, you do it right here. What can parents do? Well, you know this, early readers. But that's taking that sort of warm and fuzzy message of read to your kids, it's important, and placing it in a broader context. In the context, part of it's economic, part of it's a pride in the country. Part of it is, can we afford to be the first generation of Americans to leave a lesser America behind? That's the question on the table. Remember when Tom Brokaw wrote The Greatest Generation? What are they going to say about us? We were the most complacent generation. We accepted mediocrity. We accepted elected officials who paid little attention to the important business in which we're in. That's the message that needs to go out there to your messengers. Enough about the libraries being nice places, they are. But in today's environment, it needs a hard edge. It needs Jamie going around telling these guys to get off their ass. The world's changed. Another thing you talked about was the investment, where to invest. Whether you're talking about putting your own money into stocks, bonds, debentures, exotic instruments that Bank of America and others have picked up, or putting the public's money into libraries, the issue is exactly the same. It's been defined earlier. What is the return on investment? Particularly in today's economic environment, the library system in the state, not that long ago, worked with, they knew what the investment was, a little bit different terminology than Jamie used. This is the per capita that went in, that goes into that library system, the local per capita on an annual basis, $19.70. I think Jamie used a monthly basis. This is annual basis, 1970. So multiplied by 12 is close. So we looked at it this way. How far does that get you today? Well, you can go out for a large pizza, 4 toppings, iced tea. Forget about one of the teas, 1970 doesn't cover that. We'll go to a movie, forget the popcorn. Or if you're going at night, forget the popcorn and leave somebody at home. 1970 won't go further. A book, 1970 probably gets you 75% of a book. If you get a real good deal, 2 months. Same sort of thing that Jamie was talking about earlier today. You've got to put the return on investment. What are the alternative economic costs? What else could you do with that? So we looked at it that way and said, okay, that's what 1970 will get you in Union County. Alternatively, 1970 will get you access to that number of adult books, books for juveniles, and those other sorts of things. And something I haven't seen many people do, and I think it's a good sell. Find the number of juveniles. You can get this in your county. How many juveniles are there in Wayne County? Where they are? Divide that into the number of books for juveniles. And then you're showing, particularly if you can make the early on importance of reading to children and children developing reading skills, then you place it in the context, just like Jamie did earlier, in terms of what is that saving the parents? Let's say this translates into 8 books for each young kid in that particular county. There's 8 times $20, maybe $15 that a parent does not have to spend if he or she uses the library. It's return on investment. Another point. Anybody familiar with this book? Highly recommend it. Survival in our era of killer competition. Go back to the point that was mentioned earlier this morning in terms of framing and what you say about yourself and some of the messages that we looked at. Here's what 3 search engines have said about themselves. A lot of people would say, well, Google, isn't that what a library used to do? Do I need to drive 1.5 miles down to the library when I can sit at home on my PC or my Mac, dial up Google, and there I am? whether it's we haven't marketed it aggressively enough or we've used the wrong marketers, too many people think that the declining relevance is because they can Google. Well, there's some differentiators. Web of deception, particularly highly recommended. I get no cut for this book. That's one of the first sentences in the book. This paragraph follows that one. You can make the story, you can write the story, or you can just display it graphically. For example, this was a picture that widely circulated on the web in December of 2001. Film extracted from the ruins of Tower 2 after 9/11. Guy, moments before his death. It turns out if you see this guy, though, run. Because not only was he on the top of the World Trade Tower 2, he was there when the Hindenburg exploded. Sailed on the Titanic. Fortunately, he survived. He was also at Ford's Theater the night that landed. Point being, there's a bunch of pure crap on the internet. There's not a bunch of pure crap in the library. The differentiator is truth and just a bunch of stuff. Even Wikipedia, which has cleaned up its act, every election, you'll see it happen now. You can go, it's a little bit harder to do that, but you can still go on. If you are, let's say you're a Republican running against a Democrat, you go to his or her website. Johnson was arrested 4 times in 2004 on child molestation charges. And stays there until it's corrected. So much of what's on the internet is biased, politically, religiously, whatever else. You're in the business of taking bias out. Facts. If you don't use this quote, you should. That was made by technology director of a major West Coast high-tech firm. That firm. Look it up, it's a true quote. There's a world of information. And then there's the library and the library staff, who I think of as knowledge navigators. You're to cut through all the bull and get to the knowledge. And it's to a certain extent, it's a false comparison of internet versus libraries, because to no small extent, you use technology. You use Google. You let people use Google. You all know this report. The percent of Americans that use the public library to access various degrees of information, whether it was job search or something else. So the comparison of you versus the Google machine at home, have a differentiator. And then there's others differentiation, and we'll take a break here just a minute. I've heard an awful lot of talk about NC Live, what you can do on it. There must be some great real-world examples as to where people have used that to make a difference. I don't know, but you probably generate some of them. All I hear is generality. I don't hear the real story. What is it that somebody has gone, either sitting in the library or at home using the library website and their own library card membership, what have they been able to do that they could not have been done otherwise? Develop those stories, because without the stories, it just sounds, it has no impact on somebody who doesn't believe on you already. We don't need to convert those who are already on board. They're on board, and obviously there are not enough of them, or we would not be feeling the tight economic times we are now. You convert people with surprising them, with real stories. Anybody got one on NC Live? Greg?
I was just going to tell you that NC Live has a survey up right now. It says My Story. It's on their website. They're collecting some of the
Oh, great.
for library patrons to go directly into cash.
Thank you. You know, Greg, is there a timetable for when that will be?
I think it's just about 3 track.
Oh.
And I think it got narrowed. I don't think it's every kind of, it might have been ebooks and audio and stuff like that. I think it was on really kind of research. It was a sort of the first stab at that.
Oh, that's great. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, why don't we take a 15-minute break and we'll reconvene at, say, 2:50.
What's that? No. I wish you get access to it.
They were